Warm. That's it. Done.
1984. A mangled wreck. Razzle is dead. 1995. He loses his little girl, Skylar. Then come the whiskey-soaked arrests, the cuffs, and the public meltdowns. On stage, the crowd isn't watching a rock god anymore. They're watching a man struggling just to keep his own shadow from falling apart. This wasn't a run of bad luck. It was a trajectory. First the guilt, then the grief, then the bottle as a bunker. He kept putting that old mask back on, betting his legacy could still carry the load. It couldn't. Every comeback wasn't a triumph. It was just another attempt to drag the wreckage into the spotlight. Vince Neil's story didn't start when the world decided he just aged poorly. It started much earlier, right where the personal catastrophes stopped being speed bumps and became the road to a slow-motion collapse. The armchair critics love a simple story. Vince blew it, hit the bottle too hard, got lazy, went to seed, lost his edge. For the public, it's a tidy little narrative. One label, bad lifestyle, case closed. But here's the rub, that only covers the wreckage at the finish line. It ignores the spark that lit the fuse. This didn't start with gray hair or a bloated face. By the time the world noticed he was slipping, the engine had already blown. The loop was more vicious than bad habits. Impact, booze, escapism, total loss of control. Then the desperate crawl back to the rock star persona, only to hit the wall again. This wasn't some lazy frontman who stopped hitting the gym. This was a man spiraling into a black hole, while everyone else just called it rock and roll excess. That was the myth. It blamed the age and the ego, but the facts point to something much darker. The rot wasn't skin deep. It wasn't an accident, and it sure as hell wasn't late stage. The structural failure had been building for decades. If you see more than just poor discipline here, if you see the real tragedy buried under the headlines, sound off in the comments. We want to know which part of this story hit you the hardest, but don't go anywhere. Because behind that convenient narrative was another myth entirely, the version of Vince Neil they spent decades selling to the world. Vince Neil was sold as the poster child for glam metal chaos, bleach blonde hair, fast cars, booze, girls, and that neon smile. It was the ultimate dream, the idea that you could live that fast and never have to foot the bill. In the MTV era, that pitch was bulletproof. The press didn't want a complex man with a fractured soul. They wanted a symbol of rock and roll excess they could slap on a magazine cover over and over again. That's how the great myth was born. Vince always bounces back. After every wreck, they sold the public the same comeback shot, the new tour, the big reunion, another hit of nostalgia. Same grin, same bad boy, supposedly outrunning his own demons. No, it was a bait and switch. They weren't selling Vince's recovery. They were selling a brand where self-destruction wasn't a tragedy. It was the main attraction. The late career reunions just cemented the lie. The nostalgia machine didn't save Vince. It didn't bring him back. It just shrink-wrapped the rot and called it authentic. The audience looked at the eternal survivor and missed the headline. The man wasn't surviving anymore. Only the myth was. 1984. The sound of twisting metal. Razzle is gone. This should have been the hard stop. Not for the charts, but for the soul. Usually, after a wreck like that, the old life ends. The old mask is buried. But the machine didn't skip a beat. Vince stayed out front. The suits don't do pauses for a personal body count. They have a schedule, a bottom line, and a role that needs a warm body. And Vince's role was lucrative, the face of chaos and rock and roll excess. That's where the rift started. The man was hit with a reality he couldn't outrun, but the brand demanded he look the same. No toning it down, no reflection, just the same wild side Vince the world already bought into. Razzle's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the great divide. Inside, he was splintering. Outside, they still expected the high-octane show. From that moment on, the collapse wasn't an incident. It was the blueprint. Before Skylar, you could write off Vince's story as the usual rock and roll checklist: booze, chaos, and reckless choices. It was a gritty tale, sure, but it was still just a star playing a dangerous game. After his daughter died, that narrative falls apart. The scale changed. Suddenly, he wasn't just a frontman with a problem. He was a father facing an irreversible void. You can't simplify Vince to a reckless bad boy anymore. Skylar's death shatters the convenient labels. It isn't a string of scandals. It's the story of a man hit where it hurts most and left to survive the aftermath. This isn't about pity. It's about the cold, hard facts. After a blow like that, the bottle and the disappearing acts look different. They aren't part of the rock star brand anymore. They are symptoms of an internal collapse that no tour, no reunion, and no hit of nostalgia could ever fix. The 2000s and 2010s weren't a comeback, they were a fire sale. The reunions, the reality TV, the vintage hits the industry kept Vince in the rotation long after the wheels had clearly come off. It didn't matter that the struggle was impossible to ignore. The public saw it all: the bloat, the missed cues, the total loss of control, the cuffs, the bottle, and the heavy wear and tear. It wasn't a string of bad nights anymore. It was a systemic failure. But the nostalgia machine doesn't do pity. It does branding. It didn't see a ruined life. It saw a familiar face. It shrink-wrapped the decay and sold it as authentic. That was the darkest part of the grift. They didn't hide his downfall. They baked it into the brand. The worse he looked, the more it fed the myth of the bad boy who always returns, even when there was nothing left to return to. Late-stage Vince Neil isn't just a sad career move. It's a case study in how the machine turns a human collapse into a commodity. It was too uncomfortable to ask what this cost him as a man. It was easier to consume the caricature, easier to swallow the lie. Yeah, he's falling apart, but that's just rock and roll. The myth outlived the reality. The crowd chose to cheer for a hollowed-out symbol rather than look at the real price of a life spent breaking in front of the world. By the finish line, the crowd wasn't even looking at Vince Neil. They were looking at a convenient scrap of his former self. Decades of damage were boiled down to a single profitable snapshot. The slurred words, the stumbling, the next viral joke. The myth took on a life of its own. This wasn't about one bad night or a public faceplant. It was about how his destruction was repackaged as entertainment. What should have been a red flag was sold as just another part of the brand. And the less Vince there was left in the frame, the easier it was to market the caricature. Vince Neil checked out of his own story long before the world admitted it. The name was there. The face was there. The moves were still there. But the myth was already running the show. In the end, the crowd wasn't laughing at a falling rock star. They were laughing at a man whose legend had already buried him alive.